Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe, a channel where we learn English through real-world topics and global events, and where our main goal is not to shock or scare you with headlines, but to help you calmly understand what is happening in the world using clear, simple, and thoughtful English that builds your listening skills and your confidence at the same time, no matter where you are listening from today.
Thank you for joining us today because in this episode we are talking about an important and sensitive topic: US soldiers killed in Syria. What happened and why it matters. And from the very beginning we want to be clear that this podcast is an educational discussion, not breaking news, not political propaganda, and not an emotional reaction, but a structured explanation designed especially for English learners who want to understand global issues without confusion or fear.
Syria is a country that often appears in international news, sometimes quietly and sometimes suddenly. And even though many people think the Syrian conflict belongs to the past, the reality is that Syria remains a long-running conflict zone where political instability, security challenges, and foreign involvement continue to shape events on the ground, which is why incidents involving international forces still happen and still matter for global politics today.
When we talk about Syria, we are not talking about a single simple war, but about a very complex situation where many regional and global actors have interests, responsibilities, and disagreements, and understanding this complexity helps English learners see how international news stories are connected, how governments make decisions, and why one event in one country can have meaning far beyond its borders.
This topic is important because it helps us understand why international forces, including U.S. troops, are still present in Syria, what role global powers play in maintaining or challenging stability, and how long-term conflicts do not simply end when headlines disappear, which is a valuable lesson not only for understanding politics, but also for learning how international news is discussed in English.
For English learners, listening to topics like this is extremely useful because it introduces real vocabulary used by journalists, analysts, and educators, such as conflict, stability, presence, involvement, and regional tension. And by hearing these words in calm and clear conversations, you can slowly become more comfortable understanding serious topics in English without feeling overwhelmed. Before we continue deeper into today's discussion, we would like to kindly ask you, dear listeners, to support the English Globe by liking this video and subscribing to the channel, because your support helps us continue creating long, educational English podcasts that focus on understanding the world while improving language skills at the same time. We would also love to hear from you in the comments, so please tell us where you are listening from today, whether you are learning English at home, during travel, or while working, and feel free to share your thoughts or questions about today's topic, because respectful discussion and curiosity are an important part of learning both language and global awareness. As we move forward in this episode, remember that our goal is not to take sides or create fear, but to explain why Syria still matters in global politics, why events there continue to appear in international news, and how following such topics in English can help you become a more confident listener and a more informed global citizen. With that in mind, let us begin our calm and clear exploration of today's topic, starting with the broader background of Syria and why this country remains so important in understanding current world affairs through the English language.
In this section, we will talk about a question many of you might have asked. Why are American soldiers in Syria in the first place, and what exactly is their mission there? Because understanding this clearly helps us grasp why recent events matter and also helps you learn English in the context of real global issues. So let's begin by explaining the original goals of the U.S. mission in Syria with calm and simple language.
The United States first became actively involved in Syria's conflict more than a decade ago, and while the situation has changed many times since then, One of the earliest and most consistent objectives of US forces was to fight against the extremist group known as the Islamic State, which is often called IS or ISIS, because this group did not only control large areas of both Iraq and Syria at one time, but also carried out deadly attacks in both the region and around the world. And international forces, including the United States, agreed that these extremists needed to be stopped, which led to a mission focused on counter-terrorism and preventing the group from regaining territory or influence.
Even after ISIS lost much of the territory it once held, remnants of the group remain active in parts of Syria and have continued to carry out insurgent attacks and deadly assaults on local forces and on international troops, including those from the United States. And this ongoing threat is one reason U.S. forces have remained present, because counterterrorism operations do not end simply when a territory is lost. And U.S. military officials have repeatedly said it is important to continue working to make sure that ISIS or similar groups do not return to strength and again seize territory or inspire attacks.
Another important reason the United States maintains troops in Syria is to support regional stability alongside partner forces that operate on the ground, because the conflict in Syria involves not just foreign militaries but also local fighters and communities. And the United States has worked with groups such as the Syrian Democratic Forces, which include Kurdish-led units, to conduct joint operations against extremist threats and to help train, equip and advise these partners so that they can secure areas, protect civilians and prevent violence from returning. And this cooperation with local forces is a key part of the US mission because it allows American troops to contribute without being the only force on the ground. It is also important to recognize that the role of US troops in Syria is not the same as a full-scale invasion or occupation with the aim of controlling the country's government or political decisions, because the mission is more focused on targeted operations, training, advising, and supporting local forces, rather than direct governance or broad military occupation. And this difference between combat roles and advisory roles is something that often causes confusion in news reports, especially when words like military presence are used without clear explanation. For example, when we talk about an advisory role, we mean that US soldiers may work alongside Syrian partner forces, helping them plan operations, share intelligence, and train in skills such as security patrols and counter-terrorism tactics, rather than being directly responsible for local governance or law enforcement. And although there have been situations in the past where US troops have been engaged in combat actions, such as airstrikes or raids against extremist leaders, these actions are generally part of the counter-terrorism mission, rather than a broader offensive war.
It is also true that U.S. troops have been stationed in specific strategic areas of Syria, such as in the northeast, near Kurdish-led forces, and at outposts like Al-Tanf in the southeast, because these locations are important for preventing the resurgence of extremist groups, and also for limiting the influence of other regional actors that could destabilize the region further. And while this might sound complicated, the key idea for language learners is to understand that military strategy often involves geography and relationships with local partners as much as it involves direct engagement.
In simple terms, the presence of US forces in Syria has been guided by several core goals: to prevent extremist groups like ISIS from regaining territory or influence, to help stabilize areas so that local populations can live with greater security, and to work with partner forces who know the land and the people better than foreign soldiers ever could. And by focusing on these clear objectives, you can better understand world news when these topics appear in international headlines.
One more thing to remember is that the situation is dynamic and may change with new developments, diplomacy, and shifts in regional politics. But for the purposes of learning English and understanding why U.S. troops are in Syria, this explanation emphasizes the concept of a mission with specific goals rather than general combat or broad military involvement. And this distinction is often repeated in official statements from the U.S. Department of Defense and other international institutions.
So, to summarize in simple English, US troops are in Syria because they are part of a long-term effort to stop extremist violence, to support stability and security with local partner forces, and to help prevent the return of dangerous groups that caused major conflict in the past. And understanding these reasons not only prepares you to follow news about Syria more confidently, but also introduces vocabulary and structure that are often used when discussing international affairs in English.
In this section, we will carefully explain what is publicly known about the incident involving U.S. soldiers in Syria, and we want to make it very clear from the beginning that our purpose is not to dramatize the event or assign blame, but to help our listeners understand the situation calmly and factually, because learning how to follow serious news in English requires patience, clarity, and respect for verified information rather than emotional reactions or speculation.
According to official statements and widely reported information, the incident occurred during ongoing security operations in Syria, where U.S. troops are stationed as part of an international mission focused on counter-terrorism and regional stability, and reports indicate that the soldiers were targeted during their duties, which sadly resulted in loss of life. But beyond these confirmed facts, many details are still carefully reviewed by authorities, which is why responsible news reporting avoids dramatic language and focuses only on what can be confirmed.
What we know so far is based on statements from military officials and trusted news agencies, which usually explain where an incident happened in general terms, such as a particular region or operational area, without revealing sensitive details that could put other personnel at risk. And this is an important point for English learners to understand, because official language often sounds limited or cautious, not because information is hidden, but because accuracy and safety are priorities.
The location of the incident is usually described within the broader context of U.S. operations in Syria, often in areas where international forces work alongside local partners, and these regions are known to be unstable due to the presence of armed groups and unresolved political tensions, which means that incidents can happen even when there is no major offensive or large-scale military operation taking place at that moment.
It is also important to understand the context in which such attacks occur, because Syria remains a complex environment where different groups operate, borders are not always clearly controlled, and security threats can emerge suddenly. And for this reason, officials tend to describe incidents as part of ongoing risks, rather than as isolated or shocking events, which helps avoid emotional overreaction and keeps the focus on long-term stability.
As English learners, one useful skill is learning how to recognize the difference between confirmed information and speculation, because shortly after incidents like this, social media and some online platforms often spread unverified claims, dramatic theories, or emotional opinions, while responsible journalism clearly separates what is known from what is still under investigation. And this careful language is something you will hear often in professional English news.
For example, you may notice phrases such as, according to official sources, early reports suggest, or an investigation is ongoing, and these expressions are used to signal uncertainty and responsibility, not weakness. And understanding these phrases helps you follow news stories more accurately and also improves your ability to speak and write about serious topics in English in a respectful and informed way.
Another important point is avoiding emotional or graphic descriptions, because while the loss of life is serious and deserves respect, educational content focuses on understanding causes, context, and consequences rather than details that can cause fear or distress. And this balanced approach is especially important for English learners who are practicing listening skills and want to stay focused on language and meaning rather than shock.
When officials speak about such incidents, they often emphasize that investigations are carried out to understand what happened, how security can be improved, and how similar risks can be reduced in the future, and this process takes time, which is why early information may change slightly as more facts are confirmed, reminding us again why patience and verified reporting matter.
So, when we look at what happened, the key takeaway is that US soldiers were involved in an incident during their mission in Syria, the event occurred within a broader environment of instability, and authorities have shared only confirmed information while continuing to investigate. And this careful approach helps maintain accuracy, safety, and credibility in international reporting.
For our listeners learning English, following this kind of factual explanation is extremely valuable, because it teaches you how serious global events are discussed using neutral language, cautious wording, and respect for uncertainty, which are essential skills if you want to understand international news, participate in thoughtful discussions, or simply stay informed without becoming overwhelmed.
As we move forward in the podcast, remember that understanding what happened does not require emotional language or assumptions, but clear facts, verified sources, and an open mind. And this approach not only supports responsible global awareness, but also strengthens your ability to listen to, understand, and communicate complex ideas in English with confidence and maturity.
To understand why incidents sometimes happen in Syria, it is important to first understand who operates in these areas, and we want to explain this in a very careful and neutral way, because Syria is not controlled by a single actor or authority across the entire country, but instead includes many different forces, interests, and power structures that have developed over years of conflict, which makes the situation complex and sometimes difficult to follow for people who only see short news headlines.
Syria includes a mix of government forces, local security groups, regional militias, international partners, and foreign military presences, all operating in different areas and often for different reasons. And while these groups do not always interact directly with each other, their presence in the same country creates overlapping zones of influence, which increases tension and makes long-term stability more difficult to achieve.
One important idea for English learners to understand is that modern conflicts are often not simple wars between two sides, but instead involve many actors with changing relationships, temporary cooperation, and long-standing disagreements. And Syria is a clear example of this type of environment, where local, regional, and international interests intersect in ways that are not always visible in short news reports.
Regional tensions also play a role in shaping who operates in Syria, because neighboring countries and global powers often support different local partners based on security concerns, political goals, or strategic interests. And this creates what analysts often describe as proxy conflicts, where larger powers do not always fight each other directly, but instead influence events through support, presence, or cooperation with groups on the ground.
This type of indirect involvement can increase risk because even if international forces are focused on limited missions, such as training or advising local partners, they still operate in areas where other armed groups may see their presence as a challenge or a symbol of foreign influence, which can lead to attacks intended to send political messages, rather than to start full-scale military confrontations.
This helps explain why military bases or outposts are often targeted, because they represent organized authority, international involvement, or strategic positions, and even small or remote bases can become symbols within a larger conflict environment, which makes them vulnerable in regions where security conditions remain unstable and where control over territory is not always clear or permanent.
It is also important to note that many of these areas experience ongoing economic hardship, displacement of civilians, and weak local institutions, which can contribute to insecurity, because when communities face long-term instability, it becomes easier for armed groups to operate, move, or recruit support, even if local populations themselves desire peace and normal daily life.
For English learners, it is useful to notice how professional analysts describe this situation using careful language, often saying that Syria is a fragmented security environment or a multi-actor conflict, rather than using emotional or dramatic words. And this type of vocabulary allows discussions to remain informative and respectful without oversimplifying the reality on the ground.
Avoiding oversimplification is very important, because saying that one single group or one single cause explains everything would be inaccurate. and understanding this complexity helps listeners avoid misunderstandings, stereotypes, or fear-based conclusions, especially when following international news in a second language like English.
When we hear about incidents involving international forces, it is helpful to remember that these events happen within a web of regional politics, local security challenges, and historical tensions, and not necessarily because of sudden changes or single decisions, which is why analysts often emphasize long-term patterns rather than focusing only on one event.
So, when we ask who operates in these areas, the most accurate answer is that many different actors are present, each with different goals and levels of influence, and this overlapping presence creates both cooperation and conflict, stability and risk, which explains why maintaining security in Syria remains a difficult task even after years of international attention.
For our listeners learning English, following this kind of neutral explanation helps you understand how complex global issues are discussed professionally, using balanced language and structured ideas. And it also prepares you to listen to future sections of this podcast with a clearer understanding of why incidents occur without reducing the situation to simple or emotional explanations.
As we continue, keep in mind that understanding complexity does not mean approving of conflict, but rather recognizing reality as it is, and this skill is valuable not only for following world news, but also for developing strong listening and critical thinking skills in English, which is one of the main goals of the English Globe. In this section, we will discuss why incidents like the attack on U.S. soldiers in Syria continue to occur, and it is very important to emphasize from the start that our focus is on patterns and context, not assigning blame to any party, because understanding recurring risks in conflict zones helps English learners see the logic behind news events and also improves comprehension of professional reporting without sensationalism or speculation.
One of the main reasons incidents continue to happen is instability in conflict zones. In countries like Syria, the government does not always have full control over all regions, and local security forces are sometimes limited in their ability to protect civilians or prevent attacks. This creates an environment where armed groups can move, operate, or even launch attacks without immediate consequences, and this persistent instability is a key factor that explains why foreign troops, such as US soldiers, remain at risk even during routine missions.
Another contributing factor is the risks associated with foreign military presence. When soldiers from one country are stationed in another country, even for advisory or defensive roles, their presence can be perceived as interference or as a symbol of foreign influence, which can provoke attacks, sometimes strategically intended to send political messages. It is important to understand that these risks are not caused by the soldiers themselves, but are part of the broader security dynamics in a region where multiple actors have competing interests and historical tensions.
To understand why attacks continue despite precautions, we also need to discuss asymmetric warfare, a term used to describe conflicts in which one side uses unconventional tactics against a stronger opponent. In Syria, local groups may not have the same military capabilities as international forces, so they often use smaller targeted operations, ambushes, or improvised strategies to achieve their goals. This type of warfare can create unpredictability and makes it difficult for conventional military forces to completely prevent attacks, even when they are well prepared and highly trained.
Another reason incidents keep occurring is that peace is difficult to maintain in a region where multiple local, regional, and international interests intersect. Even when formal ceasefires or agreements are in place, enforcement is often weak, mistrust persists, and competing agendas continue to influence actions on the ground. This creates an ongoing cycle where security measures and attacks exist alongside one another, which is why analysts frequently emphasize that temporary stability does not automatically mean long-term peace.
For English learners, it is useful to notice the vocabulary used here. Words like instability, asymmetric, security dynamics, and competing interests appear repeatedly in professional news reporting and analysis. Understanding their meaning and usage helps learners follow long discussions about global issues without losing comprehension, and it also improves the ability to discuss complex topics in English clearly and responsibly.
It is also important to highlight that incidents like these are often predictable in pattern, though not in timing, which means that analysts can identify high-risk areas or situations, but cannot always predict the exact moment an attack will occur. Recognizing patterns, rather than focusing on individual blame, allows learners to approach news with calm reasoning, rather than fear or emotional reaction, and helps develop critical thinking in addition to language skills.
Another point to understand is that even highly trained military personnel operate within constraints. Terrain, local alliances, and logistical challenges all play a role in how troops move, secure locations, or respond to threats. In complex conflict zones like Syria, these factors combine to make incidents more likely, and understanding these structural and environmental realities helps learners see the bigger picture beyond dramatic headlines.
Finally, understanding why incidents continue to occur reinforces the importance of contextual thinking, which is essential for anyone following global news or learning English through real-world topics. By seeing repeated patterns, understanding asymmetric warfare, and recognizing the risks of foreign presence, learners not only understand the specific event, but also gain insight into larger processes that shape international conflicts, regional security, and military operations around the world.
So, in summary, incidents like attacks on US soldiers in Syria happen repeatedly because of a combination of ongoing instability, the risks associated with foreign presence, unconventional or asymmetric tactics, and the inherent difficulty of maintaining peace in a region with overlapping local, regional, and international interests. Recognizing these patterns rather than assigning blame is a key skill for understanding news in a calm, factual, and professional way. And it is also a valuable exercise for learners who want to strengthen English comprehension through global events.
As we continue to the next sections, keep in mind that focusing on patterns and context, rather than emotion or speculation, is not only a lesson in global awareness, but also a method for improving your English listening skills, because professional news and educational content often use these neutral, analytical approaches to explain complex topics clearly and responsibly.
By following these explanations carefully, learners can gradually build vocabulary, develop understanding of conflict dynamics, and gain confidence in listening to, analyzing, and discussing serious international issues in English, which is exactly what we aim to do here at the English Globe.
When incidents like the attack on US soldiers in Syria occur, many people naturally wonder whether this could lead to a larger conflict or even a full-scale war. And it is very important to approach this question calmly and carefully, because understanding the difference between an isolated attack and an escalation that might involve multiple countries requires context, facts, and a clear explanation, and this is exactly what we aim to provide today while helping English learners follow professional language in news reporting and analysis.
First, it is essential to recognize that an isolated attack, no matter how serious or tragic, is not the same as the start of a larger war, because a single event usually involves specific circumstances, locations, and actors, whereas a full-scale war involves prolonged military campaigns, multiple regions, and coordinated engagement between opposing national forces or alliances. And the distinction is critical for understanding news coverage, because headlines often make small incidents appear as though they signal something much larger than the facts support.
Governments generally respond to incidents like these with measured actions, balancing the need to protect their personnel and interests with the importance of avoiding unnecessary escalation. And responses may include increasing security, conducting investigations, issuing public statements, or engaging in targeted defensive operations, rather than immediately engaging in wide military campaigns. And understanding these deliberate approaches helps listeners realize that one attack does not automatically trigger a larger war.
Another important factor is the use of diplomatic channels, which often work behind the scenes to de-escalate tensions, prevent misunderstandings, and communicate with all relevant parties. And diplomacy can be far more effective than military escalation in achieving long-term security and stability, especially in complex conflict zones like Syria, where multiple countries and local actors are involved. And learning how to describe this in English helps learners expand their vocabulary related to international relations and global security.
It is also helpful to understand why news headlines can sometimes be misleading, because media outlets often use attention-grabbing language to attract viewers or readers, and phrases suggesting imminent war or large-scale escalation may be used even when official statements and expert analysis indicate that the situation is being contained. And for English learners, this is an excellent example of how careful reading and listening can prevent unnecessary fear and misunderstanding while improving comprehension of nuanced reporting.
Professional reporting frequently emphasizes terms like isolated incident, limited engagement, and ongoing investigation, which signal caution and accuracy. And these phrases help audiences understand that while an event is serious, it does not necessarily change the overall balance of military activity or regional stability. And recognizing these subtle differences is an important skill for anyone following international news in English, because it allows you to separate emotion-driven speculation from factual analysis.
It is also worth noting that historical patterns show many isolated attacks do not escalate into wider wars, because governments are usually careful to maintain proportionality in their responses, and military strategists and policymakers often prefer containment and risk management rather than aggressive action that could trigger unintended consequences or broader regional conflict. And understanding this approach provides both realistic perspective and language practice for expressing conditional and causal relationships in English.
For example, we often hear in professional briefings that security measures have been increased, or an investigation is ongoing, and these carefully chosen words indicate ongoing attention and caution, rather than signaling immediate retaliation or a sudden war. And using such phrases yourself when discussing sensitive international topics in English will help you sound accurate, professional, and neutral, which is exactly what we aim to teach through long-form podcasts at the English Globe.
Finally, it is important for listeners to recognize that while serious incidents like attacks on U.S. soldiers are newsworthy and require attention, they exist within a broader pattern of international relations where escalation is often avoided through diplomacy, careful communication, and targeted security measures. And this context allows English learners to engage with news responsibly, enhancing both language skills and global awareness without causing unnecessary anxiety.
So, to summarize this section, incidents such as the one we are discussing do not automatically indicate the start of a larger war, because governments respond carefully. Diplomatic channels often work to prevent escalation. Isolated attacks are different from full-scale conflicts, and headlines can exaggerate risks. And understanding these distinctions provides clarity, encourages critical thinking, and strengthens the ability to listen and discuss international news in calm, professional English.
By recognizing patterns rather than reacting emotionally, learners can approach complex global topics with confidence, gradually building vocabulary, comprehension, and analytical skills, which is one of the main goals of the English Globe, because learning English through real-world events requires both accuracy and perspective, helping you become informed, responsible, and articulate while improving your listening and speaking skills in the language.
As we move forward to the next sections of this podcast, remember that careful analysis, verified facts, and measured interpretation are the keys to understanding international incidents. And by practicing this approach, you not only improve your English, but also develop the ability to think critically about news from around the world in a calm and structured way.
In this section, we will explore what incidents like the attack on U.S. soldiers in Syria mean for ordinary people around the world. And it is very important to understand that even though these events happen thousands of miles away, they can influence global perceptions, economic conditions, travel safety, and the way countries interact with each other. And for English learners, this discussion is an excellent opportunity to practice understanding complex ideas expressed in long, flowing sentences while building vocabulary related to global affairs.
First, incidents in conflict zones can shape how ordinary people perceive global security, because news about attacks involving international troops often raises questions about safety, stability, and the risk of wider conflicts. And even if there is no immediate threat to civilians in other countries, repeated reports can influence public opinion, government policies, and the general sense of how secure the world feels. And by following this language carefully, English learners can understand terms like perception, security environment, and risk assessment, which are commonly used in professional reporting.
Another important factor is the economic and energy implications of instability in regions like Syria, because the Middle East plays a significant role in global energy supply, trade routes, and market confidence. And when attacks or tensions appear in news reports, they can affect oil prices, international investments, and economic policies even in countries far from the conflict zone, which is why understanding global news is not only about safety, but also about how interconnected the world has become. And hearing these explanations in English introduces phrases such as market volatility, energy supply chains, and economic impact, which are useful in both academic and professional conversations.
Travel safety is another area that can be indirectly affected by events like this, because governments often issue advisories or warnings for citizens traveling to certain regions, even if the immediate location of an incident is remote. And airlines, embassies, and international organizations monitor conflicts carefully to protect travelers, which means that ordinary people planning vacations, business trips, or work abroad may need to pay attention to news and follow guidance, and describing such precautions in English requires understanding vocabulary like advisory, travel restrictions, and risk assessment, which learners can practice in context through discussions like ours.
Incidents in Syria also influence international relations, because when foreign troops are attacked, governments must respond diplomatically, coordinate with allies, and communicate with domestic populations. And these responses often involve a mix of public statements, strategic adjustments, and behind-the-scenes negotiations, which ordinary people may not see directly, but which affect how countries cooperate or compete on other issues, such as trade, defense agreements, and regional partnerships. And understanding these dynamics helps learners comprehend complex sentences and abstract ideas in English.
Understanding news matters because it allows ordinary people to make informed decisions, whether related to voting, international business, education, or simply following world events responsibly. And when you learn English through real global topics, you not only practice listening and comprehension, but also gain the ability to discuss international events with clarity, using professional vocabulary and neutral phrasing that is respected in academic, journalistic, and professional settings.
It is also worth noting that while individuals may feel distant from conflicts like Syria, global interconnections mean that these events can have ripple effects, such as affecting refugee flows, humanitarian assistance, international aid policies, and even domestic security measures in other countries. And understanding this chain of influence allows English learners to see how one localized event can have global consequences, which is a valuable perspective both for language practice and for developing critical thinking skills.
For example, when news reports mention increased security measures, international cooperation, or humanitarian programs, they are describing actions that ultimately impact ordinary lives around the world, from the cost of goods to travel policies. from international awareness campaigns to domestic political discussions. And learning to interpret these phrases in English allows learners to connect vocabulary and grammar with real-world contexts, reinforcing both comprehension and practical usage.
In summary, incidents such as attacks on U.S. soldiers in Syria are not just military events. They affect global security perceptions, economic stability, energy markets, travel safety, and international relations. And by understanding these connections, ordinary people can engage with news responsibly and thoughtfully, while English learners gain valuable exposure to long sentences, professional vocabulary, and structured explanations that are common in news and educational content.
For our listeners, the key takeaway is that learning English through real-world events allows you to see how global politics influences daily life, from economic decisions to travel planning, from personal awareness to professional discussions. And by following long, carefully structured explanations like this, you gradually develop the ability to comprehend complex ideas, use precise vocabulary, and discuss serious topics with confidence, all while improving listening skills and critical thinking.
As we prepare to move into the next section, remember that connecting global events to ordinary life is not only a way to make news more relevant and understandable, but also an effective method for practicing English in realistic, professional, and responsible contexts, which is exactly the goal of our podcast here at the English Globe, helping learners build both language skills and global awareness at the same time. In this section, we will focus specifically on English vocabulary that has appeared throughout today's discussion about U.S. soldiers in Syria, because one of the main goals of the English Globe is not only to inform you about global events, but also to help you improve your English listening and comprehension skills by learning how professionals discuss complex topics clearly and accurately.
We will go through 10 to 12 key words that are often used in international news, military analysis, and political reporting, and we will explain their meanings, provide examples in context, and show you how they are commonly used so that you can recognize them when reading or listening to similar stories. This approach also helps you practice understanding longer sentences and professional phrasing, which is essential for advanced English listening.
The first word we should discuss is conflict, which refers to a serious disagreement, argument, or fight between groups or countries. And in our context, we have used it to describe the ongoing situation in Syria. For example, a news report might say, "The conflict in Syria has lasted over a decade, affecting millions of civilians," and this word is frequently repeated in headlines, articles, and official statements about military or political tensions.
Next, we have deployment, which describes the movement of troops or resources to a specific location for operational purposes. For instance, the deployment of U.S. soldiers to northern Syria is part of a counter-terrorism mission, is a sentence you might hear in news coverage. Deployment is a common term when discussing military operations, humanitarian missions, or emergency response teams. And understanding this word helps learners follow the logistics of international events.
Another important term is stability, which means a state of being steady, secure, and free from sudden change or disruption. In our discussion, we often referred to efforts by international and local forces to maintain stability in conflict zones. A real-world example could be, international partners are working to ensure stability in areas previously controlled by extremist groups. This word frequently appears when analysts describe peacekeeping efforts or economic recovery in post-conflict regions.
Escalation is another key term, which refers to an increase in intensity, seriousness, or magnitude, especially in a conflict or dispute. For example, news reports might use it like this: tensions in the region could lead to an escalation of military activity if not managed carefully. Understanding escalation is critical for English learners because it appears in headlines and analyses about international crises, showing changes in risk levels without requiring dramatic storytelling.
The fifth word is advisory, which refers to providing guidance, recommendations, or expert support. In Syria, U.S. troops often serve in advisory roles to local forces, meaning they help plan operations, share knowledge, and train partners without being the main combat force. For example, a report might say, U.S. military advisory teams are assisting local forces in security planning. Learning this word helps you describe professional roles accurately in English.
Operations is another term we frequently used, and it refers to organized actions or missions carried out for a specific purpose. News coverage often states, military operations were conducted to prevent the resurgence of extremist groups, which highlights both the strategic planning and execution aspects of military work. Recognizing this word allows learners to understand detailed descriptions of military, humanitarian, or even business activities in English.
Next, we have region, which simply refers to a specific area or part of a country or the world. In our discussion, we mentioned the northeastern region of Syria, where international forces are stationed. A news example could be, the region has seen increased security incidents in the past month. Understanding geographical references like this helps learners follow the context of global news stories.
Investigation is another frequently used term, which means a formal process of examining facts, gathering evidence, and understanding what happened. For example, an investigation is ongoing to determine the cause of the attack, is typical phrasing used in neutral reporting. Learning this word is important because it appears often in professional English news, legal discussions, and official reports.
Another key term is partners, which refers to groups, organizations, or countries that work together toward shared goals. In our context, U.S. forces often work with local partners in Syria. A sentence in news might read, international forces and local partners coordinated efforts to stabilize the area. This word is useful for English learners because it appears in discussions about cooperation, diplomacy, and joint projects.
Adversary is another word that is often used in professional discussions, referring to an opponent or entity that presents challenges or opposition. In our context, analysts might say, operations aim to reduce the threat from adversaries in conflict zones. This term is neutral and professional, and learning it helps learners discuss conflicts without using overly emotional language.
Finally, risk is a term that helps explain potential danger or uncertainty. For example, the risk of attacks remains high in unstable areas, is a sentence you may encounter in reports about military or humanitarian situations. Understanding this word helps learners interpret information about safety, security, and precautionary measures in English.
By reviewing these 10 key words, conflict, deployment, stability, escalation, advisory, operations, region, investigation, partners, adversary, and risk, learners can better understand professional news reports, follow long discussions, and gradually improve vocabulary related to global affairs, military operations, and international relations, all while practicing comprehension of long sentences and structured arguments in English.
We encourage listeners to pay attention to these words in real news, podcasts, and articles because repeated exposure in context helps retention, improves listening skills, and builds confidence in understanding long and complex English sentences without losing focus or meaning.
The more you practice listening to long educational content like this, the more you will notice how these words appear naturally, how they are connected in professional discussions, and how you can use them yourself when explaining global events, writing essays, or participating in conversations about international affairs in English.
By carefully studying vocabulary in context, learners not only expand their word knowledge, but also develop skills to follow reasoning, understand patterns, and critically engage with news stories, which is exactly why the English Globe structures its podcasts with long, informative dialogues that blend language learning with real-world knowledge. In this section, we are going to focus on how to talk about sensitive news in English, which is an essential skill not only for learners of the language, but also for anyone who wants to discuss current events responsibly, because many topics, such as international conflicts, attacks, or political tensions, require careful wording, clear thinking, and respectful communication. And learning these skills improves both your English and your confidence when engaging with serious subjects.
The first principle is using neutral language rather than emotional language. Neutral language focuses on facts, observations, and context, without inserting unnecessary judgment or strong emotions. For instance, instead of saying, "This terrible attack proves that the region is completely unsafe," you could say, "An incident occurred in the region, which highlights ongoing security challenges." Neutral language communicates the same idea without exaggeration and is preferred in professional news, academic discussions, and formal English writing.
Another important skill is expressing opinions respectfully. In English, you can share your thoughts while signaling that others may have different views. Phrases such as, "in my opinion," "it seems that," or "from my perspective," help introduce your ideas without making them sound absolute or confrontational. For example, you could say, "From my perspective, continued international presence aims to stabilize the region," which is professional and respectful, and learners will notice that such phrasing is common in diplomatic statements, news analysis, and classroom discussions.
It is also very helpful to practice asking questions instead of assuming, because asking questions encourages dialogue and allows others to provide information or clarification, which is particularly important with sensitive topics. For example, instead of saying, "This happened because one side failed," you could ask, "What factors might have contributed to this incident?" This method demonstrates curiosity and professionalism while avoiding judgment or speculation, and it is a key technique used in interviews, educational settings, and professional meetings.
Using these strategies also helps learners sound professional in discussions, whether you are speaking with classmates, colleagues, or in online forums. For example, combining neutral language, respectful opinions, and questions can produce sentences like, "The attack demonstrates ongoing risks in the region. How might international efforts help improve stability?" This structure presents information clearly, invites conversation, and models the kind of formal English often used in news reporting or academic presentations.
It is important to notice that neutral and professional language does not mean avoiding difficult topics or softening the reality. You can still communicate the seriousness of an event while remaining factual and respectful. For instance, saying, "The incident resulted in casualties among US personnel and authorities are investigating," provides the essential information without dramatization or emotional embellishment, which is exactly the type of language used in professional journalism and educational materials.
For English learners, practicing this approach can involve rewriting sentences from news articles or creating your own summaries of events using neutral phrasing. You can focus on three components: describing the facts, indicating context, and signaling ongoing developments, all while avoiding emotional or exaggerated words. This method not only improves vocabulary and grammar, but also strengthens listening comprehension because you learn to identify precise meanings in long, professional sentences. In addition, it is beneficial to notice how experts hedge their statements, using expressions like may, might, could, or appear to, which allow them to discuss complex topics without asserting certainty in situations where facts are still emerging. For instance, the attack might reflect ongoing instability in the region, shows careful reasoning, and demonstrates a level of sophistication that is often found in professional English discussions about international affairs.
Finally, learners should practice summarizing news events in their own words using these techniques. For example, instead of repeating sensational headlines, you could say, "According to verified reports, US forces were targeted in Syria, and investigations are ongoing to understand the circumstances," which conveys the essential information clearly, neutrally, and respectfully, and also provides an excellent model for classroom or conversational English practice.
By consistently applying neutral language, respectful opinion phrases, questioning instead of assuming, and hedging statements when appropriate, English learners develop the ability to talk about sensitive topics with professionalism, accuracy, and clarity, which is a highly valuable skill for academic, professional, and social contexts alike, and it also prepares listeners to understand international news without misunderstanding, panic, or overreaction.
So, in conclusion, discussing sensitive news in English requires a combination of techniques: staying factual, avoiding emotional exaggeration, expressing opinions politely, asking questions, and using careful transitions and hedging. By practicing these strategies regularly, learners not only improve vocabulary and sentence structure, but also gain confidence in listening to, analyzing, and talking about real-world events in a professional and responsible manner, which is exactly the type of skill we aim to develop in the English Globe podcasts.
As we reach the conclusion of today's podcast, it is important to take a moment to calmly summarize everything we have discussed, reflecting on both the global news topic and the language learning value embedded within it, because understanding complex international events does not have to cause fear or anxiety. Instead, it can strengthen awareness, critical thinking, and English comprehension. Today, we explored the tragic incident involving U.S. soldiers in Syria, carefully examining what happened, who operates in these areas, and why incidents like this continue to occur, all while maintaining a neutral, factual perspective and focusing on verified information rather than speculation or sensationalism.
We began by setting the context for Syria, explaining why the country remains significant in global politics, why multiple actors are present, and how long-standing instability has created environments in which international forces operate. We then discussed the role of U.S. military presence, including the objectives of deployment, cooperation with local partners, and the distinction between combat and advisory roles. These foundational explanations help learners follow world events with clarity, understand professional reporting, and recognize recurring patterns rather than reacting to individual incidents with alarm.
In Section 3, we described the incident factually, focusing on publicly confirmed details, its location, and context, emphasizing the importance of relying on verified sources, which is crucial both for responsible news consumption and for learning English in a structured, professional manner. Section 4 provided a neutral overview of the actors operating in Syria, illustrating the complexity of the environment without sensationalizing extremist activity or simplifying regional dynamics, and Section 5 explored the reasons why incidents like this continue to happen, including instability, asymmetric tactics, and the challenges of maintaining peace.
In Section 6, we addressed a common concern: whether such incidents indicate the beginning of a larger war. We emphasized the difference between isolated attacks and full-scale conflict, the careful responses of governments, the role of diplomacy, and why headlines can sometimes exaggerate risks. Section 7 connected global events to everyday life, highlighting their impact on perceptions of security, economic factors, energy markets, travel safety, and international relations, demonstrating how even distant incidents can influence ordinary people and reinforcing the importance of following news critically.
Section 8 focused on English vocabulary, providing learners with 10 to 12 important words such as conflict, deployment, stability, escalation, advisory, operations, region, investigation, partners, adversary, and risk. We discussed their meanings, examples, and usage in real-world news contexts, which not only improves comprehension but also strengthens the ability to discuss international topics in clear, professional English. Section 9 addressed the language and etiquette of discussing sensitive news, including neutral phrasing, respectful opinions, asking questions rather than assuming, and using hedging language to sound professional, all of which are essential skills for learners engaging with serious content.
As we reflect on today's episode, it is important to reaffirm that understanding complex global issues is not the same as fear. Knowing what happens in conflict zones, why incidents occur, and how governments and international actors respond allows individuals to remain informed and make thoughtful decisions without being overwhelmed by anxiety. The goal is to cultivate awareness, not panic, and this approach also models how professional news outlets communicate events responsibly, which is extremely valuable for learners practicing both comprehension and critical thinking in English.
We encourage all of our listeners to continue practicing English by engaging with long, educational content like this, because listening to extended explanations, professional dialogues, and structured discussions helps develop vocabulary, sentence comprehension, and the ability to follow complex reasoning. Learning English through global topics also has the added benefit of expanding cultural and political awareness, helping learners connect language skills with real-world understanding, and improving the ability to articulate ideas clearly in both spoken and written formats.
For example, the vocabulary and phrasing we covered today, such as stability, escalation, advisory roles, investigation, partners, and risk, are not just words to memorize, but tools that allow learners to interpret news, summarize events, and participate in discussions about global affairs in a professional and informed manner. By regularly practicing these skills, listeners can gradually feel more confident in following international reporting, analyzing patterns in conflict zones, and engaging in conversations that require careful reasoning and neutral language.
It is also essential to remember that listening to long-form educational podcasts, rather than short headlines or sensational clips, provides the mental space needed to process information critically, understand context, and observe professional English usage in real time. By doing so, learners build endurance in comprehension, develop the ability to recognize nuanced phrasing, and gain familiarity with vocabulary and sentence structures that are often repeated in professional discussions about global politics, military affairs, and international relations.
In conclusion, today's episode of The English Globe has shown that discussing serious events such as the attack on US soldiers in Syria can be approached calmly, responsibly, and educationally. We have covered the incident itself, the broader context, the actors involved, patterns of risk, potential misconceptions about escalation, relevance to ordinary people, key vocabulary, and strategies for professional English discussion. By following structured, factual, and respectful explanations, learners can improve language skills, expand knowledge of global affairs, and develop the ability to engage thoughtfully with complex information in English.
Remember, understanding global issues enhances both language proficiency and critical thinking. It allows learners to differentiate between fact and speculation, to discuss sensitive topics respectfully, and to build confidence in professional English usage. Engaging with real-world content in this way reinforces long-term retention, listening comprehension, and analytical skills, making learning both meaningful and practical.
Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us today at the English Globe. Keep practicing your English by listening carefully, noting new vocabulary, and reflecting on the context of the news. Remember that every new topic you explore helps you become a stronger, more confident English speaker, capable of discussing global events thoughtfully and professionally. We look forward to welcoming you in our next episode, where we will continue to combine English learning with real-world knowledge, helping you grow in both language and understanding of the world around you.
Before we end, we kindly encourage our listeners to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments, letting us know where you are listening from and what you think about today's topic, because engaging with the community is another way to practice English and deepen understanding. Thank you again for your attention, and keep learning, reflecting, and listening.
Stay curious, stay informed, and keep improving your English. Because knowledge of the world and mastery of language go hand in hand. This concludes our detailed discussion, and we hope it provides both insight into current events and a valuable learning experience for your English journey.